Believe me, I did a lot of research on it. And according to all the research, it was way worse than anything I showed you.
In 2004, Mel Gibson shocked the world with The Passion of the Christ. It broke records, sparked outrage, and changed Hollywood forever. But after years of silence, Gibson has finally spoken. And what did he reveal? Nobody can explain it. Why did he wait until now to tell the truth? Stay with us, because what you're about to hear might change the way you see everything. The obsession begins. By the late 1990s, Mel Gibson was at the top of his career. He wasn't just a popular actor, he was one of the most powerful people in Hollywood. He had starred in hit movies like Braveheart, Lethal Weapon, and The Patriot. He had won Oscars. He was wealthy, admired, and could choose just about any role he wanted. In the film world, Mel was a king. His influence in the industry meant that studios would listen when he spoke, and his name alone could help bring millions of dollars to any movie project. But while everything on the outside looked perfect, behind closed doors, Mel's life was starting to fall apart. Fame and fortune hadn't brought him peace. Instead, it pushed him further into a dark place. He battled addiction, mainly alcohol and depression. Even though he was surrounded by success, Mel often felt alone, lost, and broken inside. He has spoken openly about how he was spiraling downward during this time. The weight of his personal failures and the constant pressure of Hollywood life became too much. There were moments when he didn't know if he could go on. And then something happened that changed everything. One night, in the middle of this private pain, Mel said he found himself on his knees on the floor, crying out to God. It wasn't a peaceful, calm prayer. It was more like a desperate plea for help. Mel has said that it wasn't like rediscovering faith the way someone picks up an old photo album. It was more like something inside him broke. The gospel wasn't comforting to him at first. It was heavy. It felt like a responsibility. He said he didn't just want to share the story of Jesus. He had to. Mel believed it was being placed on him like a weight he couldn't ignore. That's when the idea for The Passion of the Christ was born. It didn't come to him during a happy, creative moment in a movie studio. It came during personal collapse, when everything else in his life was already falling apart. And it wasn't going to be just another religious movie either. Mel didn't want a nice, family-friendly film with soft music and pretty costumes. He wanted to make something raw. He wanted to show Jesus Christ's final hours the way they really happened. Bloody, brutal, and uncomfortable to watch. Mel even went so far as to say, "My sins were the first to nail him to the cross." This wasn't just a story to him, it was personal. He felt responsible, like we all do, and he wanted the world to experience that reality. But Mel's obsession was just getting started. What came next would push him even further, to risks no other filmmaker in Hollywood would take. Building the impossible film. Once Mel Gibson knew he had to make The Passion of the Christ, he did what any filmmaker would do. He took it to Hollywood. He started pitching the idea to studios and producers, expecting that at least a few of them might be interested. After all, he was Mel Gibson. He was an Oscar-winning director and one of the most bankable stars of his generation. If anyone could get a project off the ground, it should have been him. But the reaction was not what he expected. Mel told them the plan. The entire movie would be in ancient languages, Aramaic and Latin with subtitles. The focus would be on brutal historical realism. No soft edges, no Hollywood glow. Just raw, painful, bloody suffering leading up to the crucifixion of Jesus. The room would go silent. People didn't know what to say. Some politely nodded, others smiled and changed the subject, and a few openly laughed at him. To the studios, this wasn't just a risky idea, it was madness. No stars, no English, no popular soundtrack, no happy ending, no chance for toys or merchandise. It was like Mel was standing in front of a crowd of experts, all telling him the same thing. This will never work. But Mel wasn't asking for permission. If they wouldn't fund it, he would. And that's exactly what he did. He put up his own money. $30 million to make the movie, and another $15 million for marketing it. That was $45 million of his personal wealth gone before a single ticket was sold. For most people, that would be crazy. But for Mel, it was necessary. He said that if he didn't tell this story exactly the way it happened, it would feel like a lie. And Mel wasn't willing to lie about something he believed had eternal importance. Most movies are made with teams of investors, big-name producers, and backers to spread out the risk. Mel was doing this alone. If the movie failed, it would wipe out a big part of everything he had earned over his whole career. He could have played it safe. He could have added famous actors, modern language, or cleaned up the violence. But that wasn't the point. To him, this wasn't just a movie project. It was a personal mission. One of the most important choices Mel made was casting the role of Jesus. After searching, he found Jim Cavzel. At that time, Jim wasn't a household name. He had appeared in a few films, but he wasn't yet a major star. What made Jim stand out was something deeper. He was a devout Catholic, a man of real faith who actually believed the story they were about to tell. For Mel, that mattered more than fame. Before Jim agreed, though, he got a warning. Someone told him that taking this role could destroy his career. They said, "You'll never work in this town again." Hollywood was already suspicious of religious movies, and The Passion was already being whispered about as controversial, even dangerous for an actor's future. Jim didn't flinch. His response was clear and calm. We all have to embrace our crosses. He knew what the risks were, but for him it wasn't about Hollywood success. It was about doing something that mattered. The strange decisions. One of the first things Mel Gibson decided when planning The Passion of the Christ was that the entire movie would be spoken in ancient languages: Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew. This wasn't just a creative choice, it was a statement. For Mel, using the real languages spoken at the time of Jesus was about more than accuracy. It was about bringing the audience as close as possible to the world Jesus actually lived in. Most people don't speak those languages today. That was the point. Mel didn't want viewers to understand everything in a normal way. He wanted them to feel it. He believed that hearing the words in their original form would make the emotions stronger. The tone of a voice, the strain in a sentence, the shouting of a crowd, these would all hit harder when you couldn't rely on familiar words. Language would become more like texture, something you feel in your bones, not just in your mind. It wasn't what Hollywood wanted. It wasn't what most filmmakers would do, but that's what made it powerful. Then came another choice that left people scratching their heads: the location. Instead of building fancy sets on a Hollywood soundstage, Mel took the whole production to Matera, Italy. This wasn't a tourist destination. Matera is an ancient town with stone houses carved into rocky hillsides. It looked like something from another century because it was. The cracked stones, narrow pathways, and worn-down buildings gave the perfect look for ancient Jerusalem. But Matera wasn't comfortable. The weather was rough. During parts of the shoot, the cast and crew faced freezing winds and icy temperatures. They weren't walking across cozy sets with soft floors. They were stepping over sharp rocks and uneven ground. It was cold, it was harsh, it was real. And that's what Mel wanted. For the crucifixion scenes, the crew didn't build a fake plastic Golgotha. They built it by hand, on location, using real wood and heavy materials. Nothing was supposed to look or feel fake. The nails were hammered by real hands. The crosses weighed what real crosses would weigh. There were no shortcuts. Everything was brutal, because that's what the story called for. But the strangest part of making The Passion of the Christ wasn't just the languages or the locations. It was what started happening on set. People began to notice strange things. During rehearsals, actors would suddenly break down in tears, not because someone told them to, but because of what they were feeling in that moment. There were moments of spontaneous prayer, even from crew members who weren't especially religious. It was like the story itself was starting to affect everyone in the room, in ways they couldn't explain. These choices, ancient languages, real locations, brutal realism, and the spiritual weight of the story turned The Passion of the Christ into something Hollywood didn't expect. It wasn't just a film. It became an experience, the supernatural storms. As the filming of The Passion of the Christ moved forward, strange things kept happening, things that made the cast and crew wonder if they were part of something much bigger than a movie. One of the most shocking events came in the form of a literal lightning strike. It happened during the scene of the crucifixion. Jim Cavzel, the actor playing Jesus, was up on the cross when it struck. Out of nowhere, a bolt of lightning shot down from the sky and hit him directly. Standing high above the rocky ground attached to the wooden cross, Cavzel became the perfect target for the electricity. The lightning traveled through his body, knocking him almost senseless. The shock was so severe that he accidentally bit through his own tongue. His body went stiff, and later, he would need not just medical attention, but 2 separate heart surgeries to repair the damage the strike had done to his heart. And Cavzel wasn't the only one. The film's assistant director, Jan Michelini, was also struck by lightning, not once, but twice during production. The odds of that happening are beyond rare, but it happened. After the second strike, Jan walked away with burn marks on his body in the shape of a cross. For many involved in the film, these weren't just accidents. They felt like signs. Then came the weather. Matera, Italy, where they were filming, is usually known for its dry and steady conditions. It's not a place famous for wild storms or sudden natural chaos, but during filming, the weather often turned strange. At times, the sky would suddenly darken, and violent winds would tear through the set. Tents were ripped off the ground. Equipment was sent flying. Crew members found themselves grabbing onto anything heavy just to keep from being thrown off balance. One minute, it would be calm and quiet. The next, it felt like a storm was crashing down out of nowhere. And just as suddenly, everything would stop again. People started asking questions. Was it just bad luck? Was it just the unpredictable nature of working outdoors? Or was it something else? To some, it felt like a warning. Making a movie about the last hours of Jesus Christ, especially in such a raw and painful way, almost seemed like stirring up something invisible, something spiritual. Many on set started to believe it wasn't just bad weather. They felt like they were messing with forces they didn't fully understand. But it wasn't just the strange events and the storms that made the production intense. The suffering wasn't only acted, it was real. Several times during the film, Jim Caviezel experienced real physical pain. In one scene showing the scourging of Jesus, the actor playing a Roman soldier accidentally missed the protective board on Caviezel's back. The whip made direct contact with his skin. It tore into him and left a scar over 14 inches long across his back. That scar is permanent. It wasn't planned. It wasn't part of the script, but it became part of the movie. The pain didn't stop there. While carrying the massive wooden cross during the filming of The Way of the Cross, Caviezel fell. The weight of the cross dislocated his shoulder. From that point on, his movements were real, not just acted. He was limping and staggering for real because his shoulder was out of place and his whole body was strained. Later, during the crucifixion scenes, the temperatures dropped so low that Caviezel started going into hypothermia. His skin turned blue from the cold. He was shaking uncontrollably. What you see in the final film isn't just acting. It's a man fighting through freezing temperatures, struggling to stay conscious while tied to a cross. The screams heard in those moments are real. The blood on his body wasn't always fake. Mel Gibson didn't plan it this way, but it was like the suffering of the character had crossed over into real life. Jim wasn't just playing Jesus. He was, in some strange way, sharing in some of the pain the story was telling. Then there were the strange coincidences, or what some would later call signs. People on set began talking quietly about Jim Caviezel's initials. JC, the same initials as Jesus Christ. By the time of filming, Caviezel was 33 years old, the same age Jesus was when he was crucified. Some dismissed it as coincidence, but others didn't. These little details, combined with the lightning strikes, the weather disasters, and the physical suffering, started to build an atmosphere that felt different from other movie productions. The battle nobody saw coming. As the Passion of the Christ moved closer to completion, it became clear that the challenges facing the film were not just about cameras, lights, or locations. There was something else happening, something deeper, something harder to explain. Some called it bad luck. Others called it spiritual warfare. Either way, it was clear that this wasn't going to be an easy project to finish. One of the biggest battles was the one with Hollywood itself. From the very beginning, when Mel Gibson pitched the movie, studios didn't want it. At first, it seemed like simple business. Hollywood executives thought it was a bad idea. They believed that audiences wouldn't sit through a violent movie in ancient languages with no stars and no chance of toy sales or soundtracks. But over time, some people began wondering if the rejection was about more than money. Why was there such intense resistance to a film about Jesus? Was it just about language and violence? Or was there a deeper discomfort about the story itself? Mel Gibson started to believe that it wasn't only about business. To him, it felt like something spiritual. He didn't say that lightly. He began to sense that what he was doing was stirring something invisible, something that didn't want this film to be made. As the filming went on, more strange things started happening to the cast and crew. Several key people on set got sick without warning. Some had high fevers that doctors couldn't easily explain. Others began having strange, vivid dreams, often about the crucifixion scenes they were shooting during the day. Some of the actors said they felt physically attacked at night, waking up with a heavy sense of dread before going back to the set the next morning. These weren't small coughs or stress-related headaches. These were sudden, intense illnesses that seemed to come from nowhere. Cavzel, who was already dealing with a dislocated shoulder, heart damage from the lightning strike, and hypothermia from the brutal cold, also began experiencing strange mental pressure. He spoke later about intense spiritual struggles happening during the shoot, moments of real fear and doubt, even though he was a man of faith. It was like the suffering wasn't just physical, it was emotional, mental, and spiritual all at once. Even Mel Gibson himself began acting differently. Crew members described him as becoming more intense as the filming continued. He would walk around the set between takes, pacing alone, reading the Bible out loud. Sometimes he would stop everyone and give speeches about why they were doing this film. He wasn't reading the Bible for comfort. He was reading it as if they were in the middle of a battle, and these were the words they needed to win. The mood on set began to shift. Even those who weren't religious could feel it. Some crew members said it felt like the very story they were telling was alive around them, pressing into the work they were doing. Others felt a different kind of pressure, a kind of darkness that seemed to hang over the production. Not something you could see, but something you could feel. Good and evil, light and darkness. The whole set seemed caught between the two. But all of this was just leading to the moment when the film would finally be released. And that's when the real battle would begin. Release day detonation. When The Passion of the Christ was finally ready for release, the people who had doubted it were sure of one thing: it was going to flop. Hollywood experts believed it had every problem a movie could have. It was rated R for intense violence. It was filmed in ancient languages that most people didn't understand. It didn't have any major stars that audiences could recognize. And it wasn't fun or lighthearted. It was a brutal, emotional, painful story. Everything about it seemed like a setup for failure. But something strange happened. Instead of movie studios leading the way and promoting the film, it was the churches. The film didn't use the usual advertising tricks. There were no big commercials during major sporting events. There were no fast food tie-ins, toy sales, or fun trailers. Instead, local pastors and church leaders became the ones spreading the word. They organized early screenings in church basements and small community centers. After watching, they would preach sermons about the meaning of the film and why it mattered. This wasn't happening just in one city or state, it was spreading across the country. Churches in big cities and small towns were lining up to make sure their members could see the movie together. Word of mouth exploded. People who never usually went to theaters were going to see it. Friends who weren't religious were getting invited by believers. Conversations were happening in workplaces, schools, and even around dinner tables. People were talking about the film before they'd even seen it. Then came the opening weekend and it shocked the world. The Passion of the Christ made $83.8 million in just its first few days. For comparison, that was the kind of money usually reserved for superhero films or huge sequels backed by massive studios. But here was this small, brutal, R-rated, subtitled movie about the death of Jesus doing numbers that didn't make sense to the experts. Theaters were packed. In some places, shows sold out for days at a time. Lines formed outside theaters like it was the biggest event in town because for many people it was. Hollywood didn't know how to respond. The same people who had laughed at Mel Gibson or turned down his pitches were now watching as his film became one of the biggest opening weekends ever for an R-rated movie. They were confused, embarrassed, and silent. The rules they thought they knew about movie making had been broken. This wasn't supposed to happen, but it did, and it was only the beginning. The box office madness was going to get bigger and the controversy was about to explode. Violent controversies. As The Passion of the Christ dominated theaters, controversy exploded. It wasn't just a movie anymore, it had become a cultural event, and with that level of attention came serious backlash. Almost immediately, accusations of anti-Semitism rose to the surface, drawing headlines across the world. The Anti-Defamation League, one of the most influential Jewish organizations in the United States, came forward with strong criticism. Abraham Foxman, who was the national director of the ADL at the time, made it clear that he believed the film could stir up harmful ideas about Jewish people. His public statements accused the film of repeating old stereotypes that suggested Jews were responsible for Jesus' death. For many in the Jewish community, this was dangerous. History had shown that accusations like that led to real violence in the past. The ADL felt that The Passion was adding fuel to a very old, very painful fire. Mel Gibson didn't back down. When asked about the charges of anti-Semitism, his answer was simple. It's scripture. That's all it is. He explained that the story in the movie was based completely on the Bible. From his view, he wasn't twisting history or blaming anyone. He was just showing what happened, exactly as written. But to many, that wasn't good enough. But anti-Semitism wasn't the only thing people were arguing about. The violence in the film became its own storm of debate. For many audience members, The Passion of the Christ was simply too brutal to watch. Some people fainted during the screenings. Others threw up. Ambulances were called in some cases when viewers couldn't handle the intense scenes of suffering. The 10-minute scourging scene, showing Jesus being beaten and torn apart, was described by some as unbearable. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was horrifying for many who had expected something more restrained. Critics piled on. Several argued that Mel Gibson seemed to enjoy the violence too much. They questioned why it had to be shown in such graphic, detailed ways. Was it necessary for the story? Or was Gibson obsessed with showing blood, pain, and death? Those questions were repeated over and over in film reviews. One of the most respected film critics in the world, Roger Ebert, gave the movie a mixed review. He was honest about its emotional power, but he also said something that caught everyone's attention. "This is the most violent film I've ever seen." That was coming from a man who had reviewed war movies, horror films, and action blockbusters. If even he was calling The Passion the most violent movie ever, it was clear that Gibson had gone beyond what anyone expected. The reaction wasn't only about the violence itself, it was about what the violence meant. Some religious leaders said the brutality was necessary. They argued that most modern people don't really understand how much Jesus suffered. To them, showing every lash, every blow, and every drop of blood was a way to wake people up to the real meaning of the crucifixion. Hollywood, meanwhile, was uncomfortable with all of it. On one hand, The Passion was making an unbelievable amount of money. On the other hand, it was causing headlines about hate, violence, and religious division. It wasn't the kind of success they were proud of. It was messy, emotional, and unpredictable. The ignored aftermath. For all the headlines The Passion of the Christ created during its release, some of the most powerful stories happened quietly afterward. Behind the success, two of the men most responsible for the film paid heavy prices, ones most people never heard about. For Jim Cavzel, who played Jesus, and for Mel Gibson, who directed it, The Passion became a turning point, but not in the way anyone expected. Before The Passion of the Christ, Jim Cavzel was a rising star in Hollywood. He had played leading roles in films like Frequency and The Count of Monte Cristo. His name was growing. Casting directors were starting to see him as a future leading man, someone who could carry big movies. After his performance in The Passion, it seemed like the next step would be mainstream fame. But then silence. The phone stopped ringing. Cavzel himself has said that things changed dramatically after the film. Offers dried up. The big studios stopped calling. It wasn't because of his acting. Many agreed that his performance as Jesus was powerful. But something about the role itself seemed to scare people away. Was he blacklisted? No one ever said it openly, but it sure looked that way. In interviews later, Cavzel said it clearly, "I just played Jesus. That was it. He didn't cause a scandal. He didn't do anything illegal. He simply took on one of the hardest roles ever put on film." And yet, it seemed like Hollywood had decided he was no longer welcome in the spotlight. The message was silent, but strong. His once bright future had dimmed overnight. Mel Gibson's story was even messier. While The Passion was still riding high in theaters, Mel looked like he could do anything. He was already an Oscar-winning director from Braveheart. He was one of the biggest movie stars in the world. But soon after, his life took a sharp turn downward. In 2006, just 2 years after The Passion was released, Gibson was arrested for drunk driving in Malibu. What made the headlines wasn't just the arrest, it was what he said to the officers. Mel launched into an anti-Semitic rant, accusing Jews of causing wars and using hateful language. The story spread everywhere. Overnight, his reputation collapsed. He wasn't just seen as controversial anymore, he was toxic. Studios that had once worked with him proudly now ran in the other direction. The movie ended, but the real struggle never stopped. Fame faded, money disappeared, but something deeper was forged in both of them. Some saw it as life-changing. Others saw it as life-destroying. Maybe it was both. If you want more videos like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and drop a comment below with your thoughts.